All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me set this up really quick. Okay, so I hope you're all ready to get a little spooky here. Because what we're going to do is, in this video, I'm going to go over chapter 5 of Frankenstein, and we're going to look at one of the key moments in this story, and that is when Frankenstein finally puts together his creation and his project, and it all comes into it all comes to pass. Okay, so we're going to see that moment. Let's go over to the screen share screen here. Here we go. Okay, so this is chapter 5. Now, remember, things that have happened prior to this, we have a lot going on. We have Dr. Frankenstein suffering family tragedy. We have Elizabeth getting sick and then passing it over to Mama Frankenstein, who eventually passes away. And this leaves a really big mark on Dr. Frankenstein, the emotional weight. Remember that he's also really also into what he's going to call natural philosophy, but he's talking about like biology and what it means to have a creation, that is alive, right? He's almost interested in kind of what it's like to be a god. So think about that, because we'll come back to that notion a few times. So he's just spent the last few months in college, right? His family hasn't really heard from him in a while. His friends haven't really heard from him in a while. He has been studying under these professors who are giving him advice and information, like Mr. Kremp. But because he's so interested in reanimating dead flesh, what he's been doing is slowly going around trying to make a reanimated person come to life. So he's been digging around in graveyards and charnel houses, which are basically big graveyards, so to speak, usually outside of like buildings or churches or something like that. But he's been digging around for parts, right? For human remains, and he gathers them in this grave robbing and takes them to whatever he has in his apartment and starts to assemble them. After a while, we're going to see that in November is when he finally starts to finish it. Okay, so he's been putting together a creation with the goal of reanimating flesh, bringing dead flesh back to life, right? An honest scientific goal. So let's look at how this works. He says, "It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils," right? So I toiled around for months and finally I got it. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m, the rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard. A convulsive motion agitated its limbs. So the creature wakes up, and it's got these yellow eyes. Keep in mind what this creature looks like in your head, how it describes it, because it's different than the traditional, like, Frankenstein's monster kind of movie horror villain kind of thing. Look how he responds. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch with whom such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. So keep an eye on this. This is what he looks like. He's got kind of flowing, like, black hair here. It's lustrous and flowing. He's got pearly white teeth. There's something kind of beautiful about him, right? And he even says as much. It's beautiful. But he calls it a catastrophe, so we know something is wrong. He continues, "The different accidents of my life are not so changeable as the feeling of human nature. I had worked for nearly 2 years." So it has been 2 years that he's been grave robbing, ignoring his friends and family, and working on this creature in his apartment. "I have worked for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this, I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation, but now that I had finished, this is the beauty of the dream had vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Right? He says the beauty of the dream had vanished. It's no longer a dream anymore. It's an ugly reality. Now it's disgusting and horrifying. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. At length, lassitude succeeded to the tumult and I had before endured, and I threw myself upon the bed in my clothes, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness. This tells us about his character. So he is horrified at what the monster looks like, and sad that his beautiful dream has been crushed by the reality of it. And what does he decide to do? He goes to his room and tries to sleep it away, right? He just tries to forget. He doesn't try to deal with problems. He doesn't try to emotionally process them. Maybe this is too much. Maybe this is a really big thing, right? But he tries to just ignore it and hope it'll go away. But it was in vain. I slept indeed, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. Notice this dream he has. I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her. We went to go hug her. But as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of her flannel. I started from my sleep with a horror. A cold dew covered my forehead. My teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed. When, by the dim yellow light of the moon, as it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtains of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaw opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to the house which I inhabited, where I remained during the rest of the night, walking up and down in the greatest agitation, listening attentively, catching and fearing each sound as if it were to announce the approach of the demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. Oof. This is where we see Mary Shelley as an author shine. This is a beautifully written scene, right? And that's not just me being a nerd about this stuff. Look how vivid it is. The pacing, it speeds up and it slows down. It builds up your emotions and carefully diffuses them. So he goes to sleep and he wakes up after this horrible dream, right? Where he sees Elizabeth and he goes to hug her, but it's actually his mom. And like, you can read into that a little bit, right? We talk about like some Freudian stuff. If you know anything about like Sigmund Freud as a psychoanalyst, this kind of complex with the mom that he has. But either way, like he has problems with people, and more importantly with death. He's afraid of it. But he wakes up from it and he sees the monster in the window, clambering into the room, right? He opens his mouth to speak and he just mutters some kind of groan or growl, nothing articulate, no actual words. But even if he did speak words, Victor says, I wouldn't have heard it anyways. I was so scared. Then what does he do again? He runs away. All right. Again, he runs down into the courtyard downstairs, locks the door and stays in there for the rest of the night, just freaking out, right? Now, granted, if this were you and this were me, I would probably freak out too. This is kind of a scary thing that's happening. So take that with what you will. He says, oh, no mortal could support the horror of that countenance. You'll see this word a lot, countenance. That means face. I would remember that because it helps a lot read this book. No mortal could support the horror of that face. A mummy again endured with animation could not be so hideous as that wretch. I gazed on him while unfinished. He was ugly then, but when those muscles, joints, and joints were rendered capable of motion, it became such a thing as even Dante could not have conceived. This is another cool paragraph. He's like, I don't know what happened. Where did I go wrong? I was putting together the monster, right? That was a gruesome, grim task, assembling human parts together. He was ugly then, right? He's still ugly now, so what happened? He's still horrifying. And then he says, when he actually became capable of motion, it became such a thing as even Dante could not have conceived. This is a literary reference. We'll talk more about these, but the word I want you to know here is the word allusion. Allusion with an A. That is a reference to a different story, text, something. So he is alluding to the story of Dante. You might have heard of Dante's Inferno. That's the book that Dante Alighieri, who is an Italian poet from like the 14th century, I think. Don't quote me on that. Dante Alighieri writes this story called Inferno. It's actually part of a larger story. But in this story, Dante, as a character, he writes himself into the book under the guidance of this poet, like this like spirit poet person, journeys through the layers of hell and sees all of the horrifying things that are there. And Dr. Frankenstein here says that this creature was so horrible that even Dante could not have conceived of something this bad. Let's keep going. He says, I passed the night wretchedly. Sometimes my pulse beat so quick and hardly that I felt the palpitation of every artery. At others, I nearly sank to the ground through languor and extreme weakness. Mingled with this horror, I felt the bitterness of disappointment. Dreams that had been my food and pleasant rest for so long a space were now become a hell to me. And the change was so rapid, the overthrow so complete. Morning, dismal and wet, at length dawned and discovered to my sleepless, aching eyes, the church of Ingolstadt, its white steeple and clock, which indicated the 6th hour. The porter opened the gates of the court, which had been that night my asylum, my rest, my home. And I issued into the streets, pacing them with quick steps as if I sought to avoid the wretch whom I feared every turning of the street would present to my view. I did not dare to return to the apartment which I inhabited, but I felt impelled to hurry on, although drenched by the rain which poured from a black and comfortless sky. So eventually morning comes, and he leaves his courtyard, and he's just kind of running away. He's just leaving again. But we have more allusions, right? Look at this. He leaves the courtyard, and the first thing he sees is this pristine white church of Ingolstadt. Right, this pristine white church. It's towering over him. Right, it's huge. It's way above him, and he sees it. He sees the steeple, and he sees the clock, and he looks at the time, and it is 6 a.m. Right. Now I'll give you an absolute rule that isn't absolute. So like I'll say it's 100% true, but then sometimes it's not. Whenever you see the number like 6 in literature, in books, things like that. It's almost always a reference to the Bible, right? Because the literature loves to reference things like the biblical or religion or things like that. But the 6, if you know anything about the number 6 in the Bible, it's the number of the beast. It has a very negative, evil connotation, right? And what does he see? He sees the church, and he sees the number 6 displayed to him, right? As soon as he does this monstrous thing. Remember, he also just hid away all night, and there's no sign of the monster. So that leaves the question, where is it? Right? This is a sign. This is some foreshadowing. This is a sign that there's some not great stuff going on. Right? That's an illusion. I continued to walk in this manner for some time, endeavoring my bodily exercise to ease the load that weighed upon my mind. I traversed the streets without any clear conception of where I was or what I was doing. My heart palpitated in the sickness of fear, and I hurried on with irregular steps, not daring to look about me. Then he says this poem to himself. Like one who on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round, walks on and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. So he's remembering this poem now about a man who's being stalked by a fiend, right? Because he feels like he could turn a corner and the monster will be there. Continuing thus, I came at length to the opposite to the inn at which various diligences and carriages usually stopped. Here I paused. I knew not why, but I remained some minutes with my eyes fixed on a coach that was coming towards me from the other end of the street. So he stops in front of an inn, sees a carriage. As it drew nearer, I observed that it was the Swiss diligence. It stopped just where I was standing, and the door being opened, I perceived Henry Clerval. Remember, that's his friend, Henry, who, on seeing me, sprung out and said, "My dear Frankenstein, how glad I am to see you. How fortunate that you should be here at the very moment of my alighting." Right? He's like, "How fortunate." And Frankenstein's probably like, "Well, I don't know. Fortunate's not the word I would use to describe me, but okay." But he gets to see his friend again. He hasn't seen him in a long time because he's been isolating himself, working on this monster for 2 years. Nothing could equal my delight on seeing Clerval. His presence brought back to my thoughts my father, Elizabeth, and all those scenes of home so dear to my recollection. I grasped his hand and in a moment forgot my horror and misfortune. I felt suddenly, and for the first time in many months, calm and serene joy. I welcomed my friend, therefore, in the most cordial manner, and we walked towards my college. Clerval continued talking for some time about our mutual friends and his own good fortune in being permitted to come to Ingolstadt. Remember, Clerval's father didn't want him to come to Ingolstadt, but now he's obviously gotten there somehow. You may easily believe how great was the difficulty to persuade my father that all necessary knowledge was not comprised in the noble art of bookkeeping. And indeed, I believe I left him incredulous to the task to the last, for his constant answer to my unwearied entreaties was the same as that of the Dutch schoolmaster and the vicar of Wakefield. So he is referencing more books, because remember, that's his thing. Like, his thing is that he knows books. He says, "I have 10,000 florins a year without Greek. I eat heartily without Greek." But his affection for me at length overcame his dislike of learning, and he permitted me to undertake a voyage of discovery to the land of knowledge. So his dad lets him go, right? "It gives me the greatest delight to see you. But tell me how you left my father, my brothers, and Elizabeth." "Very well and very happy, only a little uneasy that they hear from you so seldom. By the by, I mean to lecture you upon their account myself, but my dear Frankenstein," continued he, stopping short, gazing in my full face, "I did not remark how very ill you appear, so thin and pale. You look as you've been watching for several nights." Clerval was like, "Man, you look horrible." He's like, I want to talk about your family and how they miss you because they haven't heard from you. But man, you look awful. You looks like you've been up for several nights." And Dr. Frankenstein's like, "Well, yeah, kind of. I've been up for several years now." Frankenstein says, "You've guessed right. I have lately been so deeply engaged in one occupation." Remember that word, monomania, one occupation, right? "That I have not allowed myself sufficient rest, as you see. But I sincerely hope, that all these employments are now at an end, and at length I am free." He's like, "Hopefully I never see the monster again." I trembled excessively. I could not endure to think of, and far less allude to, the occurrence of the preceding night. I walked with a quick pace, and as soon as we arrived at my college, I then reflected, and the thought made me shiver, that the creature whom I left in my apartment might still be there, alive and walking about. I dreaded to behold this monster, but I feared still more that Henry should see him. Entreating him, therefore, to remain a few minutes at the bottom of the stairs, I darted upwards towards my own room. My hand was already on the lock of the door before I recollected myself. I then paused. A cold shivering came over me. I threw the door forcibly open, as children are accustomed to do when they expect a specter or a ghost to stand waiting for them on the other side, but nothing appeared. I stepped fearfully in. The apartment was empty, and my bed was also free from the hideous guest. I could hardly believe that in so great a fortune could have befallen me. But when I assured that my enemy had indeed fled, I clapped my hands for joy and ran down to Clerval. So the monster is gone. And for Frankenstein right now, he's like, yes, the monster is gone. That's a good thing, right? But we as readers have to ask the question, like, the monster's gone. Where? That can't be good, right? So he goes down to get Clerval. We ascended up into my room, and the servant presently brought breakfast. But I was unable to contain myself. It was not joy that possessed me. I felt my flesh tingle with the excessive sensitiveness, and my pulse beat rapidly. I was able to remain for a single instant. I was unable to remain for a single instant in the same place. I jumped over chairs. I clapped my hands. I laughed aloud. Clerval at first attributed my unusual spirits to joy upon his arrival. But when he observed me more attentively, he saw a wildness in my eye for which he could not account. My loud and unrestrained, heartless laughter frightened and astonished him. Right, I love this paragraph. It's one of my favorite paragraphs in this whole book because he's so happy that the monster's gone and he thinks it's out of his hair that he turns into a crazy person. Like, his flesh is tingling. He's clapping and laughing excitedly. He's going crazy because he is deliriously happy. He's jumping over chairs, and Clerval is like, what is happening? Like, if you're Clerval in this moment, you're like, this guy looks horrible. It looks like he hasn't slept. This guy is off his rocker, right? What has happened to my friend? Let's keep going. Yeah, because if you're Frankenstein, how do you explain this, right? He's like, oh, you know, like when you spend years at a time gathering human remains from a graveyard, stitching them together, zapping them with lightning, probably. You know, they become a huge ugly monster, and then you get scared and it runs away, but it goes away and it's fine. He's like, yeah, it happens. It happens to everyone, right? This is Monday night. My dear Victor, he said, what for God's sake is the matter? Do not laugh in that manner. How ill you are. What's the cause of this? Do not ask me, I said, putting my hands before my eyes, for I thought I saw the dared specter glide into the room. So he's like hallucinating that he sees the monster. He can tell, oh, save me, save me. I imagine the monster sees me. I struggled furiously and fell down in a fit. Poor Clerval, what must have been his feelings? A meeting which he anticipated with such joy strangely turned into bitterness, but I was not the witness of his grief, for I was lifeless and did not recover my senses for a long, long time. In this paragraph, he falls sick, and this is something he's going to do quite often. I'll just give you the heads up. He falls ill because he is in shock, right? So he literally passes out. This was the commencement of a nervous fever which confined me for several months. So this faint lasts several months, right? So then we also have to realize several months are passing now, okay? Where's the monster in that time? What's going on? We see that during that time, Henry was my only nurse, right? So Henry's taking care of him for several months, but then we still don't see any of the monster, so we have to wonder, where is he? I afterwards learned that knowing my father's advanced age, unfitness for so long a journey, and how wretched my sickness would make Elizabeth, he spared them this grief by concealing the extent of my disorder. So they ask Clerval, hey, how's Victor? Right? And Clerval's like, he's fine. He's just a little sick. Don't worry about it. He knew that I could not have a more kind and attentive nurse than himself, and in firm hope he felt in hope he felt firm of my recovery. He did not doubt that instead of doing harm, he performed the kindest action he could towards them. Move this really quick. He says, but I was in reality very ill, and surely nothing in the unbound and unremitting attentions of my friends could have restored me to life. The form of the monster whom I had bestowed existence was forever before my eyes. I raved incessantly concerning him. Doubtless my words surprised Henry. He at first believed them to be the wanderings of my disturbed imagination, but the pertinency with which I continued on the same subject persuaded him that my disorder indeed owed its origin to some uncommon and terrible event. So he keeps talking about the monster, babbling about it, and Clerval has no idea what's going on. Right? So, I mean, think about what it's like to be Clerval in this moment, taking care of this man who's clearly, out of it. By slow degrees and with frequent relapse that alarmed and grieved my friend, I recovered. So he recovers. I remember the first time I became capable of observing outward objects with any kind of pleasure. I perceived that the fallen leaves had disappeared and the young buds were shooting forth from the trees that shaded my window. It was a divine spring, and the season contributed greatly to my convalescence. So now it's spring. Where is it? I just had it here. Remember, he finished creating the monster in November, and now it's spring. Okay, that's how much time has passed. I felt also sentiments of joy and affection revive in my bosom. My gloom disappeared, and in a short time I became as cheerful as before. I was attacked by the fatal passion. Dearest Clerval, I exclaimed, how kind, how very good you are to me. This whole winter, instead of being spent in study as you promised yourself, has been consumed in my sick room. How shall I ever repay you? I feel great remorse for the disappointment of which I have been the occasion, but you will forgive me. You will repay me entirely if you do not discompose yourself, but get well as fast as you can. And since you appear in such good spirits, I may speak to you on one subject, may I not? I trembled. One subject? He said, Clerval wants to ask me one thing. What could it be? Could he allude to the object on whom I dared not even think? Compose yourself, said Clerval. I will not mention if it agitates you, but your father and cousin would be very happy if they received a letter from you in your own handwriting. They hardly know how ill you have been and are uneasy at your long silence. Is that all, my dear Henry? How could you suppose that my first thought would not be to fly towards those dear, dear friends whom I love and who are so deserving of my love? If this is your present temper, my friend, you will perhaps be glad to see a letter that's been lying here for you for some days. It's from your cousin, I believe.